Hello. So today we're going to talk about peer tutoring. I just wanted to put out some tips and tricks on how to be a peer tutor. These are just my own tips and tricks that I've developed. They're not set in stone or scripture or anything. So if you find something better, then go to it. That's great. But in the meantime, I just wanted to give you some helpful hints on some things that might help your tutoring session go well. So out of peer tutoring, I've kind of narrowed it down to 6 main things. One is getting to know the student. 2 is your body language. 3 is positive acknowledgement. 4 is what I call explain it, show it, coach it. And that's when you show how to do a problem or work a problem. Number 5 is you have the student try it, do it, and then explain it. And then 6, you end the session with a plan. Always end the session with a future plan for the student, whether it be to go home and practice numbers 1 through 10, or to go draw up a diagram of something or whatever. You want to just end the session with giving them something specific to do to come back and report back to you the next time. So this specific tutorial video is about part 1, getting to know the student. And this can be applied as you're on your very first day, especially your very first day when you sit down with a new student and start the session. So there's 4 big things that I can give as advice on how to get to know the student and what's important about getting to know the student. 1 is ask their major. 2 is get details about their home life, just any detail, if they're married, if they have children, if they live with their parents, if they have a job outside of this, any little detail about their home life. Assess their strengths and weaknesses, and you're going to be doing that as you go along, especially in that first tutoring session, to see, what their strengths and weaknesses are. And then number 4 is notice the student's learning preferences. Everybody learns differently, and so there's some core learning preferences that I'll talk about, and you want to cover all 4 of them. But if you know which ones the student really responds to, then you can really hit those hard. And if the student's having problems understanding, then you can return back to whatever their learning preference is and try to get them to understand that way. And you'll see more about that at the end of this video. So 1 is ask their major. And the big reason to do this is, to get to know the student, just to know something about them. It lets them know that you're interested, that you're not bored sitting there with them. And importantly, you can relate any examples. If you're giving examples explaining a concept to the student, you can relate it to their major. So if I have somebody who is majoring in social work, they want to be a social worker, and they're majoring in psychology or whatever, then, when you go to explain something, you could explain something like, okay, well, what happens if you're called to somebody's house to get them resources on, on where the food banks are, then you can blah, blah, blah. So you can just relate whatever examples the student's studying to their major, if it's possible. Sometimes it's just too hard, but if the more relevant you can make any of the explanations for the school, for the class, then the more interested the student is going to be. And the more interested the student is going to be, then the better they're going to do. If they're bored sitting there, or if they're not even interested sitting there, then they're not going to be an active participant in the tutoring session, and that's not going to be productive. So another thing is get a detail about their home life, and as I said, this can be, if they have a spouse, if they have children, if they're single, if they live with their parents, if they just got out of high school, if they've been out of school for a while, if they have a job outside of school, any of this, it'll build rapport and trust with the student because you're letting the student know that you're actually interested in them. And it's going to get them to open up to you a lot more. It's really not productive when you're sitting there and neither one of you trusts each other enough to open up. You have to be able to get the student to open up so you can see where really honestly where the student's at, and you can give them the best help that they get that you can. So also another thing is that you can, the more you know about the student, the more effectively you can provide some relevant examples to them. If you know that they're out on their own, they're living on their own, then if you're working a math problem, you might want to relate it to when they go to the grocery store. You know, when you go to the grocery store and something's 25% off, how much will that be, you know, if it's 25% off? Just if they haven't lived on their own yet, if they're still living with their parents, that might not be relevant to them. They might not normally go to grocery shopping, so you want to provide a relevant example to them that relates to them personally. So here's where you get into the meat of the things. Assess the strengths and weaknesses. And this is especially, you do this every session, but especially in the first few sessions, when you're sitting there going over the material with the student, you want to ask the student to read some of the material out loud. And the reason why you do this is you want to see uh, if they're reading it for the first time. It's kind of obvious if they haven't studied yet. Also, you want to notice how well how well they read. Sometimes students, you know, have some problems reading, and so that's going to affect their studying. And so you need to know that. But you don't come right out and ask the student, you know, do you have a problem reading? You know, they might not think that they have a problem reading, or they might be too embarrassed to admit it. But if you get them just to read a little bit out loud, you can see how much they stumble reading out loud, and if they, you know, if they can read something with understanding, or if they just read off the words and they don't understand what they just read. You know, it just gives you a general idea of where they're at in their reading proficiency. Also, you'll want to ask the student to do like simple math in their head, as just if you're studying math, if you're tutoring them math, then when you're going over a math problem, you can just give it to them, you know, and 5 plus 6 is, and ask them to solve that just really quickly. And you can see if they can solve simple math problems in their head, and that gives you a general idea of how well they understand math. Some students just haven't wrapped their minds around how to think mathematically. And so that means you're going to have to explain things differently than if you're talking to somebody who's a math major and can think mathematically and already gets the gist of things. Um, Also, you want to see if there might be some sort of learning disability, you know, with numbers, or with being able to think in their head, solve something in their head without writing it out. You just want to know that. You just want to be aware of that. So that way you're not harping on something that's hard for the student and making them feel bad about it. And it also, you can adjust the way you explain things to them, um, knowing their strengths and weaknesses. Now, notice the student learning preferences. So this is what I was talking about at the beginning. I've kind of narrowed it down to 4 basic ways to learn. Of course, there's other theories out there, and that's cool too. Just with me, with my experience, this is just what I normally do. You want to touch on all 4 of these learning methods every single time you're explaining something to a student, or you're tutoring a student in something. But when you go through it, you'll notice that they respond better to certain ways of learning better than others. And so knowing that, you can really hit on that and explain things in their language, so to speak. You can explain things the way they need you to explain it, and not uh, just guessing at how if they're going to be able to understand this or not. So the 4 learning methods are: first is conceptual understanding. Here's conceptual understanding right here, and that's pretty much the theory. That's the theory of why things happen. You know, why this is happening this way, how this is happening this way. This is the basic theory of whatever it is you're talking about. The next thing is you want to demonstrate in three-dimensional space or in real life. So that just means, you want to actually play it out in front of them. You want to show them if you do the problem this way, you get the wrong answer. If you do the problem this way, you get the right answer. Or if you're talking about math and measurements, maybe break out a ruler and measure something in real life so they can actually see it played out in real life. That helps tremendously, especially when you're talking about mathematics. The next thing is plug into the formulas. Sometimes you get students that um, it's not math that gives them the problem. It's that they feel more comfortable just knowing the formulas, memorizing the math formulas, and knowing how to plug in the numbers to formulas. This is the same with chemistry. A lot of chemistry is memorizing formulas and plugging in the numbers to formulas and knowing how to do that right. So plugging into formulas. Some students respond really well to that. Other students, it confuses them if they're not clear on 1 and 2, the theory and the 3D space. So you'll just have to go along and figure out if that works for the student or not, if it's helpful or if it confuses them. And then the last one, number 4, is examples. You want to show an example of something. You always want to give an example of whatever it is you're talking about so the student can apply it and they can understand how it actually works in real life and it's not just words on a page. So here's some more information about this. The conceptual understanding, it's the theory behind the facts. The theory. See, theory is the key word here. It's the theory behind the facts. It's not just that 2 plus 2 is 4 because I said so or because we memorized it that way. 2 plus 2 is 4 because if you have 2 of something and you add 2 more of that something, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 somethings. You just want to show them the theory behind why something is the way it is. And demonstrate in 3D space. Some students really just, especially with some math formulas, they need to see the principle played out in real life. This also I found works really well with a lot of chemistry, especially when you're doing the molecular structures or the atomic structures of things. If you break out, some paper clips and a eraser or something and just make a little atom or in real life or make a little molecule in real life, connect little balls together, then it'll make a lot more sense because the student's seen it played out in real life. If you're doing with math and they're doing like probabilities, I've brought dice before and we've rolled dice and you see there's 6 sides to the die, so if you roll a dice and you want to roll the number 4, you have a 1 out of 6 chance of rolling the number 4. Some students really need to see that played out in action in real life in order for them to understand the concept. So just bring some dice in, or a stack of cards. Count money, bring some money in. I've brought in a couple of dollar bills and quarters and dimes, nickels, and pennies so the student could see in real life what percentages are. Or you can map out the action with common objects, like I was saying earlier. Just take some objects and make some sort of makeshift atom or molecule so they could actually see it played out in real life, see what it looks like in 3 dimensions. Using models, especially in anatomy and physiology. Up in the library, there are anatomy models for your use. You can take the student up there as long as it's okay with your supervisor and the librarian, and you can go in there and look at the actual models in real life and so they can see it, what it really looks like. And if all else fails, if you don't have, if you can't, if you don't have any dice or money or you don't have any models that is relevant to what you're trying to teach the student, you can just draw a picture. Just draw a picture of it on paper. And a lot of times that's all you need. Once you draw a picture of something, then the student goes, oh, I see. And then you can move on with whatever you're explaining. Then after demonstrating in 3D space, you want to see if there's any formulas the student needs to know that where they have to plug in the numbers to in order to complete the assignment or in order to do the math problem or whatever it is you're studying. Sometimes students are most comfortable with just learning mathematical formulas or just rote memorization of information, and that's how they learn. They learn better if they just memorize the formula and figure out how to plug in the numbers, or if they just memorize the steps to something or procedure to something, and uh, and as long as they can memorize it, then the understanding comes after. Some students are like that. So in this case, you need to make sure that they have a way to memorize their formulas, whether it be to make like a little cheat sheet and put all of the formulas on one page and then memorize, walk around with that page and just memorize it, or make note cards, or use Quizlet, any way for them to be able to memorize things. And of course, all students are going to have to memorize things, but just some students feel really comfortable with it and some students do not. Then finally we get to examples. And you'll notice if the student learns best by watching you work an example. I've had several students that as long as I show them how to do something, then they can repeat what I just did. And explaining, and they're not so keen on theory. Explaining the theory to them doesn't really help them too much. They need to see me solve the problem, or they need to see me work the problem and see how I do it, and then they can repeat that those steps. So you set an example, you narrate out loud what you're doing. So if you're doing a math problem, you're saying these things out loud. You're like, okay, and now I carry the 1. And now we subtract 63 on both sides of the equation, because what you do on one side, you have to do on the other side, or whatever it is. You narrate out loud what you're doing and why you're doing it to the student. And then after you do that and set the example for them, have the student work a problem after a similar problem after you work a problem, and have them narrate out loud what they're doing and why, just like you just did to them. Have them narrate it back to you. So those are the 4 core learning preferences, and those are some tips on how to get to know your student and why that's important. It really makes a big difference over the course of the semester. You're going to be with the student 2 hours a week every week through the semester, and so it's a lot. Things go a lot more smoothly if you actually get to know them and you get them to open up to you, so you can communicate more effectively. So thanks a lot, and some more tutorials I have is on my YouTube channel, S. Rusan 2, St. Louis Community College.